Hey everybody, what's going on?
Hey guys.
Welcome back for part 2 of At the Table.
There it is.
Here we are. Listen, I hope that everybody had a great time last week where we kind of set the stage over the symbolism and the importance of the table factor. When it, a lot of people just see a table, but it's so much more than that. There's so many more things that come into it, and that's what we talked about last week. So if you haven't seen that one, before we dive into part 2 this week, go back and check out that one. It's like 30 minutes long. It's not that exciting, but it was good. It kind of sets the stage, right, for what we're talking about today in At the Table part 2.
Yes.
Dose.
Okay, so Aubrey, I think, of course, aren't we going to go back a little bit and explain the importance of the table a bit before you go into some historical things?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just kind of like a recap over last week, Jordan and I just got this table that has been in my family for a long time, and it just kind of hit us that it just kind of changed the atmosphere in our house when we got this table, and it's pretty big. Like you can set, I don't know, like 8 people, maybe around it, maybe 7, 8 people, something like that.
8,
yeah,
at least 8.
Right. And so it's a pretty big table, and it's awesome. And immediately after we got this table, we started having eating food in here, and we work from home, so we work from this table, and it's like we're always around the table. And so we kind of just dove in on that and was like, well, a table is a gathering place. And we talked last week in the episode about how the first church met just like this. They met around a table in a home. And, eventually the evolution of the church went from, a table to a pulpit to now it's a stage. And now we just believe that there is something powerful about sitting at the table, breaking bread with one another. And it's not just us that thinks this. This is actually like a biblical principle. And
it's not just our opinion.
Yeah, right? It's not just like a random opinion that we have. It's actually a biblical principle. And so that's what we are going to talk about today, is the biblical, just the significance of the table, using scripture and using the Greco-Roman culture that the Bible was actually written in, right? Because if you've been on this journey with us now, you know that the context of scripture, how we're supposed to read scripture, is not through the lens of like an American lens. It's a Greco-Roman. That's where
the New Testament.
The New Testament was written to the Greco-Roman world. And so in order to understand some of the principles and the things that Paul or Peter or any of these fine gentlemen are writing about, you have to understand the culture that they were living in. And so that's what we want to do today, is diving in on how the table changed everything.
Oh, how the tables turn.
Oh, the turntable. Yeah. So here's just for instance, just to start it all off, the table brings everyone to an equal level. If you ever notice, it doesn't really the table, when you sit down at the table, it kind of takes height out of the equation, because I'm 6 foot tall, and Jordan, how tall are you?
Well, I said I was 5'5.5", and then you said I was lying. So, do you remember that?
So a lot shorter than me, right? So she's a lot shorter. But when we sit at the table, look at how pretty even it is now, and we can look eye to eye. I just think that's crazy cool that the table just kind of brings everyone to the same level. And so this is critical for the Greco-Roman culture that we are studying today, because the table was actually a symbol of dignity, right? When we talked about it last week, and how like you had to be noble, or you had to be a free person to sit at the table, because all the servants and slaves had to stand in the back, and they had to serve the people that were seated at the table. And so in the Greco-Roman culture, your table, when you would invite people over to dinner and you would set up your table, you would be seated based off of how dignified you were, how fancy dressed you were, how much money you had, how much influence you had. Were you involved in the Roman government? Or you know what I mean? Like, it was just kind of, you were seated at the table based on what happens outside your home, based on how much influence you had.
And that wasn't just at the table. I mean, you were reminded of your place in society every single place you went. I mean, if you went to the theater, you had to designate a seat for your class, which means how much money you made, what your family was known for. I mean, you were classified, like you had to sit in the theater up in the nosebleeds if you had no money, you know?
Yeah.
And then even the clothing that you wore, you had to wear a certain type of clothing to show where you were situated in like class, social class, right? And then even where you lived in the city. And then, like Aubrey said, where you sat for meals.
Yeah.
Every single situation of your life, you were reminded exactly where you deserve to be.
Yeah. And so we dove into this a little bit when we were studying the lenses on how to read scripture in context and everything. But what was so crazy about the table is the Romans were used to, I mean, the table is nothing new, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's been around forever. It's not like we're coming with this mind-blowing type of teaching that's just like, oh my gosh, and then the table just changed everything. Well, it wasn't necessarily the table per se, but it was what happened at the table that changed everything. Jesus and his ministry, if you carefully watch what Jesus did in his ministry as he was walking among us in human flesh, notice who he ate with. Notice who he brought to the table with him. You think about the story of Zacchaeus, right? And Zacchaeus was despised in his town.
Tax collector. Everyone hated them. Boom.
And so Jesus walks up there, and you know, we all know the song, if you grew up in church, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And he climbed up in that sycamore tree for the Lord he was trying to see, right? Yeah. And so there's this whole jingle about it, and we think it's awesome because we learn about it in Sunday school or children's ministry or whatever, or at least I did back in the day. But we don't understand the significance of that. The significance was that the tax collectors were despised among the Jews. They were turncoats. They were Benedict Arnold, you know, in America.
Yeah, they were thieves, and they stole right in front of the Jews, their own people, and stole from them.
And so Jesus comes in and he enters the scene and he sees this little bitty man, this wee little man up in the tree, and he says, "Tonight I'm going to have dinner at your house." Boom. Everybody around was just mind blown because they're like, what you want to eat with Zacchaeus, right? But Jesus not only did he bring Zacchaeus to the table, but he brought his friends around there too. You know what I mean? And so, like, Jesus is already using the table against the Roman system. Because he's bringing the people that don't deserve to be at the table, he's bringing them to the table and he's dining with them. So you have Zacchaeus, and just like we talked about last week, you have Matthew, you have Levi, and it's same thing, same situation, tax collector.
You even have the lepers. I mean, those people weren't even allowed in the city gates. So I don't know how I don't know how that happened, but like
they were
women,
just drawn to him, I guess.
It just so many people that you wouldn't have expected to sit at the table were there with Jesus. He invited them, and
lepers, beggars, prostitutes, sinners, tax collectors, you name it. But what's so important about this is we're using the symbol of the table because Jesus was bringing these people to the table. At the Last Supper, he brought the disciples to the table to break bread, to have communion with his closest followers, with his closest confidants. And I don't think that was by accident.
No,
I think it was on purpose.
It was very intentional. It was very important to Jesus. So it makes me even think about like when someone's on death row, they get to pick their last meal.
Yeah.
Or, so Jesus knew it was his last meal. Who was he going to eat it with? It was so important to him, the table to sit down with them, right? Because they could have sat around a campfire, they could have done whatever, but Jesus was very intentional about what he did in every aspect. That's why it's so interesting when we go through and read about what Jesus did, and then, you know, get that revelation through what Jesus did and how we should be and function.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Jesus is literally coming and he's bringing people to the table and he's treating everyone as equals. Mm-hmm. And this is completely contrary to the Greco-Roman civilization, because if you've studied any type of history at all, you know that the only way that the Roman Empire was able to stand as long as it did was because of the class system. Yeah. You had the upper class and you had the lower class. And as long as the lower class knew their place, they knew that they were less dignified than the upper class, then Rome was able to continue. Rome was able to continue to expand and build because everyone knew their place. Mm-hmm. And so this is what Jesus does. Jesus comes onto the scene and he says, you know what? Everybody has a place at my table. Romans, Jewish people, especially Pharisees, were mind blown in the midst of this, because they were like, wait, what do you mean just anybody can come to your table? You're inviting all these people to the table. And so Jesus is like, Jesus flipped the script on what, instead of showing how dignified he was at the table, he chose to give others dignity at his table. Mm-hmm. And it completely changed the game.
Well, because he switched it. Jesus switched it, because Aubrey and I were just talking about this, that in the Roman world, if you invited someone to your house to eat, you brought all your best furniture and put it in the room where everyone's going to hang out and have dinner, because you wanted to show off what you have. Yeah. It was honestly about you. Like, you should have come in, like you would come in the room and be like, the party has arrived, it's me. Like, it's about you when you do a dinner for people. And like, Jesus turned it around and it was about everybody that came. It wasn't about him. Yeah. And
he chose to focus on everyone else, when the typical fashion of a Roman dinner would have been everybody focus on the host.
It was a show off.
You're looking at what everybody else is wearing and you're gauging by their jewelry and their clothes how much they have, what kind of connections you need to make with the people around the table. And Jesus is just literally saying, dude, I'm bringing in the people that nobody else wants, and I'm showing them dignity at the table. And so this is the actual point where a lot of historical people believe that everyone despised Jesus and his teachings, not necessarily because Jesus was being exalted over Caesar. And there's that whole debate of either Christ or Caesar, and that's, you know, what the whole thing. But Jesus was literally turning Roman civilization over on its head by dignifying the lower class and making the lower class feel like they were privileged and
like they were worth something.
Yeah, that they were worth something, and showing people dignity and empathy and compassion. And it was completely making the Romans look terrible. And so all these lower class people were coming to Jesus because he gave them a seat at the table.
And you know, Jesus says, was it Jesus that said, I'm in the world, but I'm not of the world?
Be in the world, but not of the world?
Yes. Jesus said that, or Paul? I don't know. Sometimes I get them.
Yeah, you put me on the spot.
Either way, it's in the Bible and it's true.
Yeah.
But it's so true, because we're supposed to live in the world, right? But not be of the world. So this is a perfect example where Jesus was not of the world. He did what his father had called him to do, right? And it flipped a society, upside down, really did. And what's beautiful to see is the transition of Jesus whenever he died and rose again, and then went up to heaven, and the Christians were here, right? They kept that going, and they did love feasts, they did agape dinners, and that's where they would do communion. It doesn't look anything like the way we do communion now. It was joyful. It was a whole meal. There was laughing. There was joy. It wasn't solemn and like you feel like you're in trouble. Sometimes I feel like that's communion at the churches. Like we're like, shh, be quiet. Yeah. You know what I mean? Not that we don't need to be respectful, but there's a different element there. But you see this transition. So the Christians, they still kept that up. Like the very, I would even say risque, because that was, very big deal for that society. And so seeing that move into the love feast, that that language talking about the love feast is in Jude 12, along with some other places in the Bible. But yeah, we're going to go a little bit more into that too. Do you have anything?
Yeah. Well, no. So yeah.
Okay.
Well, I didn't know where you're going. So the love feast, we're bringing people to the table, and so Jesus set a really cool precedence when he was walking here with us. Like, pay attention to who he brought to the table. So then we fast forward, and Paul is writing to us in Galatians. And it starts in Galatians chapter 2. And I think verse 11, is that what you wrote down there?
Yeah, it starts in verse 11.
Yeah, and so in verse 11, this is where Peter gets put on blast by the Apostle Paul. And, it's not nice. It really isn't. I think that if something like this were to happen today and another pastor were to call a different pastor out the way that Paul does Peter in Galatians chapter 2, I think there would be a lot of hurt feelings, and there would be a lot of people upset at the way, because the word that I'm looking for, actually, the word that he used according to the Bible was Paul called Peter and Barnabas hypocrites. And he said, like, they were moving in hypocrisy, basically, acting one way over here and doing something else over here. And now listen, I know none of us have ever been in that position. I know that I have. I've been a hypocrite before. But Paul is literally calling him out because of what he's doing at the table.
Yes. And so what happens there in Galatians 2, verses 11 through 21 is where this is found. Okay, so I'm going to give you like a little bit of a summary. So what happened was Peter came because Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch, and that's where they were. And so Peter came to visit. And the thing about the first century church is it was a mix of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. It was just a mix. Yeah. And so they were kind of learning. It was like a learning time of like, oh, well, they don't really abide by the law. Do we abide by the law? You kind of see this in the letters from Paul, Peter, John. All of them, they all kind of like talk about this. And it's that question of, well, how much of the law? Do we still obey the law, or is there no law? Do the Gentiles need to obey the law? It was a lot of questions like that. And so it came to be that the Gentiles did not have to live under the law of Moses. Like, it became very, there was that revelation. And so that was the way it was. Even the Jews that were born again Christians, they didn't have to abide by, they didn't have to be under that umbrella of the full law of Moses, right? Okay, so that's where we're at. And so Peter came and he was visiting Paul and Barnabas, and they were having these love feasts. They got together often. They laughed, they fellowshiped, they learned more about Jesus, the gospel, all these things, right? And they would sit at a table together, a table like this. Yeah. And Jews, Gentiles, all of them, all mixed, sitting together. It's beautiful, beautiful picture when you think about it, and you think about some of the issues that they were dealing with too. And so it comes to where there are some Jews that come in from Jerusalem, and they come to Antioch, and then all of a sudden Peter switches, and he doesn't allow the Gentiles to sit with him and the Jews that came. And even Barnabas jumps on the wagon, and so they separate themselves, and it becomes a really obvious, awkward, painful thing. Like, picture yourself as a Gentile. You probably are. I am. And picture yourself as that someone you were so close to, somebody that you really was teaching you amazing things, right? They were building relationships with Peter, and then all of a sudden Peter's like, yeah, you're not good enough to sit with me anymore. Like, all of a sudden it just switched. And Paul wasn't going to have it. Like, he was upset, and it was actually very obvious that since this offense happened in front of everyone, Paul confronted it in front of everyone. And so there was a lot of wisdom there with that. And yeah, it wasn't very pretty because he did call Peter and Barnabas hypocrites. But what's really interesting about the Greek word hypocrite is it means to put on a mask. And so I think that's really interesting too, because Peter was all about hanging out with the Gentiles before those Jews came in. And he was even eating pork. He was doing all these things that Jews wouldn't do, right, when they were under the law of Moses. And then all of a sudden, things switch. And he acts like he's been abiding to this law of Moses, like, since day one, because the Jewish Christians came. And another thing I was reading too is that he may have feared that they saw this when the Jews came, that they would see Peter mingling with these Gentile Christians and they could go back to Jerusalem and maybe get him like a lower position or something. So there was fear of man and there was pressure involved in this. And like Peter knew the truth, right? But he still didn't, I guess, abide by that truth.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's important to understand that Peter, of all people, saw how Jesus brought people to the table. You know what I mean? Like Peter was there the whole time.
Yeah, he saw this.
And he saw Jesus continually. And Peter rocked with Jesus the whole time, even though, a lot of times Jesus came under fire for who he brought to the table. And this actually shows me it's kind of like Peter suffered from that fear of man thing continually.
Dude, I connected with Peter on this story.
Yeah, well, and think about when Jesus says, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And when people came and got all up in his grill, actually, what does it say? There was a little girl that was like, hey, aren't you the one that was with Jesus? And he got
he was scared of a little girl.
He backed down. He backed down from what he knew to be true because of the fear of man. And I think that we all kind of suffer from that at times. And that's why teachings like this are so important to understand at the table, is because Jesus set a precedent. And Paul very clearly called out Peter on this, because Paul's like, Jesus set this precedent. It's not what I'm coming to the table with. It's like, and he's like, Peter, you know better than this.
Well, yeah, and Paul even went down to the fact of like, so you're telling me when we live under the law, you're pretty much saying the death and resurrection of Jesus means it's not enough. Is that what you're saying? Like, and when you think about it, when we get stuck in our works, that's what we're saying. And that was painful to hear. But I was reading a commentary on Galatians Chapter 2, what I was reading, and the commentator said the social pressure pushed Peter to compromise, and then said that he still believed the gospel, but he failed to practice it. And so, he didn't forget. He didn't. It was the pressure. It was the fear of man, to where he knew, which is kind of it's a really scary place to be, where something, but you act on something else.
Well, and I think that we can all relate with that in a way. There's been so many times in my walk with the Lord that I was put in a position where like I knew the right thing to do, but yet compromised, because it was like, well, this will kind of be a win-win for all parties, instead of doing what I knew to be true. There's that little slight moment of compromise there, and you know what I mean, and it just kind of,
and I think that's I know that's why I love the Bible so much, because there are real people in the Bible, real people that make real mistakes, and they walked this earth, they loved Jesus, they seek the Father, but there were also times where they knew the truth, but they didn't do the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that we're all kind of getting the picture of really like what we're trying to get at with this series of being at the table, because like we talked about last week, and the Psalms tells us that you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and like we understand that that Jesus came to the table and he brought all these other people, and it was completely against culture, is completely against everything, and then we have Paul on the scene. And he's calling out Peter, because Paul is ministering to these Gentiles, and they're like, hey, Peter was eating with us, and then all of a sudden now he's not. And, but Paul calls out Peter, and he's like, you know better than to do this. And so it kind of leads me to a place of what is it? What is it that we can do to bring everybody to the table? Because I know that when we've been involved in the church and everything like that, like we can oftentimes get comfortable in our seats, and we can look at other people that might be entering our church on Sundays, and we can be like, oh man, and we could know everything about that person, and we can oh, bless their heart, yeah, they definitely need to be here, and we can put ourselves in a position where we are literally looking down on people, and not necessarily putting ourselves in a position of, oh, well, we're going to be around the table and everybody else is like a slave or a servant, back here. Like not putting ourselves on levels quite like the Romans in a very physical, but what about spiritually? When we look at people and it's like, well, they're clearly not anywhere close to our level. Mm-hmm. I can't be seen with that person because that'll make me look terrible, or I don't want to waste time on that person because I'll never get that time back, mm-hmm. and I don't ever see any parts of scripture at all to where you have people wrestling with should I be at the table with you? Jesus never talked with his disciples and was like, hey, do you think that we should go mm-hmm. and hang out with these people or not? I mean, he just went. He was about the Father's business. He just walked in obedience, and he broke bread with the least acceptable, with the chiefs among sinners, and he set that precedence that here at the table we are all equal. Mm-hmm. We all have dignity. We all have something to bring, to share, to give somebody that place.
And like during this whole time that we're reading in Galatians, and most all the New Testament Christians are being killed.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important to remember, because the Christians at that time, they were destroying the order that the Romans were trying to do. Come on. The Romans weren't scared of Jesus in general. They were scared of what was happening because, okay, well, he's not here anymore. I thought we killed him. Why is this becoming such a big thing? Why is there a lot of little Jesuses everywhere? Why is this happening? Right? And so I just kind of want to ask the question to you, because Aubrey was already asking some questions that will kind of get your heart, and your mind going. But are we destructing the orders of our world, or are we abiding by them? Because the Christians back then were dying. I mean, they called them Roman candles. You remember that? Those were Christians that they were setting on fire and set them up like torches in the city, on the city walls, so you could go down the road and see where you're going. Okay, so I just want to ask you that question. Are we just abiding by the world? Are we fitting in with the world, or are we destroying it with flipping it upside down like the way Jesus did? Because that's super convicting. Because I have to be honest. Okay, if you're just going to church every Sunday and you're reading a Bible verse here and there, and you've made it almost like rules in your head of things you need to get done throughout the day, our mindset's wrong. So I have a question. It's an old question, but if you were put on trial with the whole, you're a follower of Christ, if you're a follower of Christ, you'll be proven guilty. Do you have enough evidence to be proven against you? Right? It's an old one, but it's a really good one too. So I just want to ask that question because it's powerful.
Yeah, and it makes you think a little bit more into not necessarily why I should do this or why I should do that, but it's just like being drawn to do that, to where it's you're drawn into relationship with Christ. What was it that it said in there talking about that God, Jesus doesn't seek people based off of who's more dignified than others, but
it's who knows him.
Who knows him better.
And who doesn't.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Do you know Jesus, or do you not?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Not that we all don't fall short, right?
Exactly.
We just read an instance where Peter, upon this rock I will build my church.
Yeah, Apostle
Peter. Himself. Disciple number one, you know what I mean? Like, he was there for every major thing in Jesus' ministry. And even there, he's sitting here, Paul's having to correct him for something that he fell short in doing. So it's not about being perfect, but it's about saying, do I treat everybody as not just equal to myself, but better than myself? Jesus brought these people and he came into their house and broke bread with them. And he could have sat there and just been all about himself. But instead, he was always trying to find out more about other people. And he was trying to grow his disciples and grow everybody that he was breaking bread with. Like he treated others better than, he thought, or he treated others higher than than what he thought of himself. And so I think that that's what we have to really understand when it talks about being at the table, is you've been seated, right? You've been seated at the table with Christ, and he wants you there, and you want to be there. Who else are you bringing with you? And I think that's an important question that we can all ask ourselves. Is Jesus drawing us to the table? Of course, the answer to that question is yes, right? He's drawing us to the table. Who am I bringing with me to the table? Because at the table, we all see eye to eye. We're on the same plane. And when you bring people to your table and you're breaking down barriers and you're breaking down what the world says, like, oh, you shouldn't be hanging out with that person, you shouldn't be doing this. If the world is saying that to you, then you're probably acting more like Christ than anybody else. So here we are. We're at the table. This was part 2.
Yes.
Next week we're gonna come back and we're gonna be talking a little bit more about being at the table. And this episode was kind of others focused, where we're like, who are you bringing to the table? What are you doing? It's more outward focused. Next week, we're going to dive in on the inside. We're going to dive in like on you specifically, because believe it or not, there are a lot of people out there that feel that they don't deserve a seat at the table with Christ. And you're right. You probably don't. We don't.
We definitely don't.
But Jesus says that you do. When he gave himself for us and he shed his blood for us, that gave us the opportunity to have a seat at the table. Jesus wants you there. We want to be there. And so we can't wait to dive in on that next week.
Yes. So we will see you for part 3 of At the Table next week. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Hey, say bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye. Oh, okay. Bye-bye.